There was a man in Kingston, Jamaica, December 3rd, 1976, with a single purpose: to send a message written in bullets. His name was James Carlton Mitchell. For 17 days he had been watching the rehearsals at 56 Hope Road, counting the security guards, timing their rotations, memorizing the patterns of movement in and out of the property. He knew Bob Marley would be there tonight, along with his wife, his band, his manager. He knew exactly which room they'd gather in before the concert. And when the moment came, 7 bullets would tear through that piece, shattering any illusion that music would rise above the violence consuming their nation. But something happened that night that James never imagined. Something that would change his understanding of power so completely, so profoundly, that 30 years later he would stand in a crowded room in Miami, tears streaming down his face, and say, "Bob Marley saved my soul when I came to take his life." If you love discovering the untold stories behind the legends who shaped music history, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications, because we reveal the divine moments of courage and compassion that transformed not just songs, but entire nations. Trenchtown, Kingston, November 16th, 1976, 11:47 p.m. James sat on the concrete steps outside his cousin's house, cleaning the toy side special that felt heavier than it should. The streets were burning 3 blocks away, tires, barricades, the acrid smoke of political rage that had consumed Kingston for months. James was 23 years old. He'd grown up 5 streets from Bob Marley's old yard, back when Bob was just another hungry kid trying to make rhythm out of poverty. But Bob got out. Bob became the voice. Bob became untouchable. And now Bob had chosen a side. At 19, James joined the People's National Party Youth Brigade, carrying pamphlets and painting walls. At 21, he carried something heavier than pamphlets when the opposition firebombed his uncle's shop. At 23, James no longer flinched when his political don called meetings at midnight and handed out assignments that had nothing to do with democracy. But James had never targeted someone famous before. Never someone the whole world knew. The dawn had been clear. Marley thinks he's bigger than the struggle. Thinks he can play peacemaker while Kingston burns. This Smile Jamaica concert is propaganda for the government. We send a message: nobody's neutral. Nobody's safe. Bob Marley was the perfect target. Here was a man preaching unity while Kingston burned, planning a free concert 2 days before a violent election, as if rhythm and bass lines could stop bullets. The government was using Bob's name, his face, his music to calm the masses. Bob had become a weapon, whether he knew it or not. So James and 6 others planned their infiltration. The plan was simple: enter through the back gate at 56 Hope Road during rehearsal, move through the kitchen, reach the room where Bob and his band gathered, deliver the message. If successful, the headlines would scream. The concert would be canceled. The illusion of peace would shatter. But there was a problem James didn't anticipate. The irony was brutal. To reach Bob Marley during rehearsal, James would have to stand outside that window and listen.
Which meant spending 3 nights hidden in the shadows of Hope Road, close enough to hear every note, every word, every moment of creation happening inside.
And despite everything James believed, despite every wall he'd built in his mind, he couldn't stop noticing something. The music wasn't propaganda. Inside that house, Bob and the Wailers were crafting something that transcended the election, transcended the politicians who tried to claim him. James heard hours of rehearsal, songs about suffering, about dignity, about refusing to let systems break your spirit. He heard Bob stop a song midway and tell his band, No, that people need to feel hope in this part. They're drowning out there. We have to remind them they can breathe." He heard Rita Marley's voice blend with Bob's in harmonies that sounded like prayer, like the kind of devotion James hadn't felt since his grandmother took him to church as a child. The night before the planned attack, James stood in those shadows and heard Bob working on a song about redemption. About how every person carries light inside them, no matter how dark the world becomes. About how violence is the language of the powerless and music is the language of the divine. James tried to cling to his anger. tried to remember his mission. But there, crouched outside 56 Hope Road, surrounded by melodies that seemed to pierce straight through his chest into places he'd locked away, something inside him began to crack. At 8:47 p.m. on December 3rd, the attack began. James and 3 others entered through the back gate, moving with the precision they'd rehearsed, guns drawn, safeties off. Inside the house, Bob Marley was eating a grapefruit, laughing with his manager Don Taylor about something mundane, something beautifully ordinary. James had read about Bob Marley, but experiencing him directly was different. Even in that split second before chaos erupted, Bob radiated something. Not just fame, but something deeper. Presence. Calm. A kind of centered power that didn't need to shout. The first shots exploded through the kitchen door. Don Taylor threw himself in front of Bob, taking 5 bullets. Rita was hit in the head. Bob took a bullet through his chest, the round tearing between his ribs, somehow missing his heart and lungs by centimeters. James stood in that doorway, gun extended, and locked eyes with the man he came to silence. But then something impossible happened. The concert was supposed to be canceled. The Smile Jamaica concert at Hero Circle was supposed to die with the attack. Every rational voice told Bob to flee, to hide, to let his wounds heal in exile. Don Taylor was in critical condition. Rita was hospitalized. Bob himself could barely move his arm. But 2 days later, on December 5th, Bob Marley walked onto that stage. 80,000 people filled Hero Circle. And when Bob emerged, bandaged, wounded, barely able to lift his guitar, the crowd's roar sounded like the earth itself was crying out. James was there. Hidden in the massive crowd, he'd come to see if his mission had worked, if fear had won. Bob approached the microphone, his movements slow, deliberate, each step clearly causing pain. When I decided to do this concert many weeks ago, there were many pressures, Bob said, his voice carrying across 80,000 souls. But I want you to know that nothing can stop what the Creator has ordained. The people who are trying to make this world worse aren't taking a day off. How can I?
The crowd erupted.
Bob began to perform, and despite the bullet wound still fresh in his chest, despite the bandages visible under his shirt, he gave everything. He moved across that stage like someone who understood that this moment transcended his personal safety, that some truths are worth dying for. James felt something shifting inside him. Bob performed for 90 minutes. Ignoring doctor's orders, ignoring the pain James could see etched across his face. He performed songs about freedom, about unity, about refusing to let violence define the future. James looked around Hero Circle. The same people he'd categorized before, political enemies, government supporters, opposition warriors, they were all there. They were all singing together. Not as divided factions, as one body, one voice, one prayer for something better than the hell consuming their city. For the first time in his adult life, James felt something that terrified him more than any political dawn, more than any rival gang, more than any election violence. He felt that he was wrong. Everything he believed, everything he fought for, everything upon which he had built his identity as a soldier in a righteous struggle. There, standing in Hero Circle, watching a wounded man refuse to be silenced, watching 80,000 people choose unity over division for 90 sacred minutes. Everything began to crumble, but James wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. He'd been sent with a mission, and people were counting on him to report back, to confirm the message had been delivered. During the 4th song, James pushed toward the front of the crowd. This was his moment. He could rush the stage, complete what started at Hope Road, prove to his dawn that fear was stronger than faith. But his body wouldn't obey. He simply stood frozen while the music and the crowd's energy washed over him. And then it happened. Bob looked directly at him. In 80,000 people, Bob Marley's eyes found James Carlton Mitchell. And for a moment that seemed eternal, their gazes locked. James couldn't explain what he saw in Bob's eyes. It wasn't judgment. It wasn't anger. Not even confusion about why this young man stood rigid and tearful while everyone around him danced and celebrated. What James saw was recognition, understanding. As if Bob could see every dark corner of James's heart, every bullet he'd helped fire, every choice that led him to that kitchen door 2 nights ago, and wasn't afraid of any of it. Bob continued singing, but never broke eye contact. And then, slowly, deliberately, Bob raised his hand and pointed directly at James. The crowd around James fell silent, turning to see who had drawn the prophet's attention. James's heart was exploding. This was it. Bob was going to expose him, call security, have him arrested for attempted murder. His mission was collapsing. But Bob didn't call security. Instead, Bob walked to the edge of the stage, still pointing at James, still holding his gaze. And he changed the words he was singing. "Brother, I see you fighting," Bob sang directly to James. "But what you fighting? Fighting yourself, fighting your soul, fighting the light, trying to come through." 80,000 people were watching this moment unfold. James's accomplices in the crowd were confused, waiting for his signal. But James couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Bob continued. "Put down that weight, brother. Put down that burden you carrying. The war you fighting ain't the real war." Then Bob did something that broke James completely. He smiled. Not a mocking smile. Not a condescending smile. A smile of pure compassion. A smile that said, "I see you. I know what you came to do. And I love you anyway." James's vision blurred. To his horror, he realized he was crying. In front of 80,000 people. In front of his accomplices. In front of the man he came to destroy. James Carlton Mitchell was crying. The concert ended. Bob left the stage to thunderous applause, and though he waved to the crowd, something irreversible had happened in those 90 minutes. James sat down on the ground of Hero's Circle, body trembling. An older woman, someone James had been mentally categorizing as the enemy, a government supporter based on the colors she wore, reached down and touched his shoulder. "You all right, son?" she asked. That word, son. James shook his head. "No," he whispered. "I'm not all right." Pause. "Don't think I ever been all right." The woman didn't understand the depth of what James meant, but she sat beside him anyway, this grandmother he'd been trained to see as opposition, and simply held space for his breaking. "That's what the music does," she said softly. "It works on the parts of you that words can't reach. Let it work on you, son." For the rest of the concert aftermath, James remained sitting and crying. When families gathered their children to leave, James wept for every childhood stolen by political violence. When lovers held each other swaying to the lingering melodies, James felt each moment of tenderness as a prayer he was too broken to speak himself. Bob had sung about freedom. James had been enslaved. Not by physical chains, but by ideology, by manufactured rage, by fear disguised as righteousness. And in that moment, listening to the echoes of Bob's voice fade across Hero's Circle, James chose to be free. After the crowd dispersed, James's accomplices found him near the stage. "What happened, man?" one demanded, angry. "You were supposed to signal. We were ready to finish this." James looked at them. These men he'd called brothers. These men with whom he'd fought and planned and bled throughout months of election violence. These men who reinforced his worst beliefs, his deepest fears, his most violent certainties. "I can't do this anymore," James said calmly. "Can't do what?" "This. All of it. The hatred, the violence, the lies we tell ourselves about who the enemy is. I can't carry it anymore." His accomplices stared like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Or maybe he'd finally found sanity. "You're a traitor," one of them spat. "We're all traitors," James interrupted, voice firm. "Traitors to our own souls, and I'm done betraying mine." They left him there in Hero's Circle. Cut all contact completely. James walked home alone that night and packed every piece of propaganda, every weapon, every symbol of his old life into boxes that he buried in his backyard. But that wasn't the end of James's story. It was just a beginning. The following week, James sought out Pastor Errol Morrison at the Sabina Park Church. He didn't know what he was looking for.
Forgiveness?
Redemption?
Punishment?
He only knew he couldn't go back to who he was. Pastor Morrison heard James's full confession, heard about the attack on Hope Road, about his political violence, about the hatred he'd carried like armor. When James finished, Morrison said, "James, redemption isn't something you earn, it's something you accept. Bob Marley showed you grace that night. Now you need to learn to show it to yourself." James began attending church again for the first time since childhood. Began volunteering with youth programs in Trenchtown, trying to pull kids away from the same political violence that nearly destroyed him. Began slowly, painfully dismantling every belief upon which he'd built his identity. It wasn't easy. James lost his friends who viewed his transformation as betrayal. Lost his job when rumors spread about his involvement in the Hope Road attack. Lost the worldview that gave him identity and purpose and a clear sense of right and wrong. But he gained something more valuable: truth. 3 years after the concert, James wrote a letter to Bob Marley. He explained what happened that night at Heroes Circle, how he came as an enemy and death transformed, how Bob's refusal to be silenced, his choice to perform despite the bullets, saved James's life. James never knew if Bob read the letter. Bob had relocated to Miami after the attack, then London, continuing his mission to unite people through music. Within 5 years, Bob Marley would be gone, cancer taking him at just 36 years old. But James carried Bob's message forward. By 1982, James was working with at-risk youth in Kingston, specifically young men being recruited into political gangs. By 1990, James was speaking at schools and community centers throughout Jamaica about choosing peace over violence. By 2000, James had established a reconciliation program that brought together former political enemies, facilitating dialogue between people who'd spent decades seeing each other as monsters. In 2006, on the 25th anniversary of Bob Marley's death, James traveled to the Bob Marley Museum at 56 Hope Road. He stood there for 20 minutes, weeping openly, thanking a man he never truly met, but who changed everything. Today, James Carlton Mitchell is 71 years old. He works with the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Kingston, helping former combatants from Jamaica's political wars find paths to peace. On the wall of his small office hangs a faded newspaper clipping from December 6, 1976. Marley performs despite assassination attempt. In interviews, James always tells the same story. The story of the night he came to deliver violence and received grace instead. "People ask me what Bob did that night," James says. "They want to know what magic words he used, what special technique made me change. But the truth is simpler and deeper than that. Bob looked at me, a man who came to murder him, and chose love. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a brother. And when someone sees you as human, when you see yourself as a monster, that changes everything." James's story never made international headlines. There's no famous footage of that moment at Heroes Circle when Bob pointed at the man who tried to kill him. Most people who attended the Smile Jamaica concert don't remember the young man crying near the stage while everyone else danced. But for James and for the 300 youth he's mentored away from political violence since then, that moment was everything. Bob Marley died in 1981. But his message, the message James tried to silence, continues through people like James. People who were transformed by encountering love when they came with hatred. In 2016, on the 40th anniversary of the Smile Jamaica concert, James was invited to speak at a remembrance event at Heroes Circle. The National Stadium Authority had organized a tribute to Bob's courage, bringing together musicians, activists, and survivors of Jamaica's political violence. Standing on the same ground where Bob performed 4 decades earlier, James looked out at the diverse crowd. Faces of all colors, all political affiliations, all ages, united by Bob's legacy. And he said, "Bob Marley taught me that we're all running from something. Pain, pain, fear. The truth about ourselves. We build walls and ideologies and enemies to protect us from confronting what's really inside. But real music, honest, divine music, breaks those walls, forces you to feel what you've been running from. He paused, overcome with emotion. I came to this place 40 years ago as a man filled with hatred. I left as a man filled with questions. And over the years, while seeking answers, I learned this: love isn't weakness. Love is the most revolutionary force that exists. It's what Bob understood. It's what he lived, and it's what he gave to a man who didn't deserve it. James's voice broke. I didn't deserve Bob's grace that night, but he gave it anyway, and that undeserved grace, that's what saved me. The crowd gave James a standing ovation. And somewhere in the applause, in the tears, in the redemption of a man who came to kill and left reborn, Bob Marley's divine message continued breathing life into a wounded world,